How's it going, YouTube? Coming in today with another video, and today, guys, what I bring to you is going to be the continuation of the deck building series, and I do hope that these videos help you. Every single format, we have to really consider our options as far as the main extra inside, because of the different decks that are going to be in the room. This video is going to be particularly helpful if you're going to YCS Orlando or any regionals upcoming, because the format's going to change pretty dramatically, even though the set itself is pretty underwhelming. There's a few cards in Suda that are really going to matter this format, and it's also going to change the way that we main deck. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later down into the video, but I do hope that you enjoyed today's video because there's going to be a lot of information we cover. We're going to talk about the things that I think that you should consider in your deck building, and then also showing you a live deck building session with my own deck. So, if you haven't already checked out one of my sponsors over at Imperium, Dragonshield, Cloud, RW, or Grimoire, definitely go ahead and do so all down below in the description. And if you already haven't subscribed to the channel, definitely go ahead and subscribe for more informative videos. And without further ado, let's hop right on into our first slide. The first thing I want to say is consider the meta. So the meta is always going to be a little different, and this format is no different. So we have cards like Twins of the Eclipse, we have the Ritual, we have Crystron, we have all these different cards that are coming out and different support cards for other decks. And then you also have to consider your main deck lineup for hand traps, even your side deck lineup. And it's really going to be interesting going into Orlando because this set is relatively new, even though people are still testing this a lot. It also is going to depend on what people can get their hands on as far as cards. What cards do you think people are going to be running? We have cards like Walls now, which is going to be very interesting because it's going to be another Mulch Army into the game. So now Tenpai has 9, which is already pretty crazy. And there's going to be a lot of different things we want to make sure that we're ready for. At this YCS, I presume there's going to be anywhere between 1,200 and 2,500 players, which is already going to be quite a lot. That means that there's going to be a lot of different decks in the room. But at a YCS, I always say prepare harder for meta than you ever do, because at a regional, I feel like it's more sane to say that you're going to run into a lot of rogue, where at a YCS, you really won't. You'll run into like Dinomorphia and Crystron and those decks that aren't like the best thing in the room, but they're still pretty good. But a lot of times you're going to be running into your Malisses, your Ryziels, your Fiendsmith variants, your Tenpais. Those are the decks that you really want to be prepared for. Now, when you're choosing a deck for the event, and then also when you're considering your deck building, you really have to think about what are your hard counters. So let's say you're building Maliss. You have to understand that pretty much every deck list right now has 3 Lancia in the sideboard, and that's terrifying. And that's something that we really have to consider going forward, because if Lancia is going to be that big of a problem, how do you deal with it? And do you want to deal with it all day? Because they have a 33% chance of drawing this card games 2 and 3. So if you win game 1, sure, you have a really good shot at winning games 2 or 3, but at the same time, this is going to be a really heavy impact to your gameplay. Now, as far as a counterplay to that, do you have any silver bullets that you can run? Can you run Mistaken Arrest? Can you run Shifter? Can you run a ton of Pistols just to make sure that your opponent is going to stay off of their play? So these are things that you really got to consider, especially if you can play a deck that can play something like Shifter. That's something that you probably just should. I always say that I hate Shifter because I do, but if you can run the broken card, you probably should run the broken card, right? Cards like Shifter shut off things like Lubellion, they shut off Ulti Slayer. There's so many different things that this card just allows you to be able to do, especially if you get under Lancia. That's fine if you change Shifter, because your opponent's still going to be under Shifter for at least 1 turn. So that's one thing where your opponent is still going to be at a loss, because if their deck can't play under Shifter, then it really didn't matter that they Lancia'd in the 1 turn, because Shifter is 2 turns and Lancia is only 1. So this is a pretty good counter that can already be in your main deck if you're playing Maliss. I would say one of the most, if not the most important thing that you have to consider when you're looking at a deck option right now is how much non-engine can you run, because the standard's like 18 to 20, right? That's something that you really want to make sure you have, and you might not perform that well if your non-engine isn't high. If you're trying to use too much engine, it really won't work out unless you have multiple pushes through boards that you're really confident with, because a lot of the end boards right now, especially from Ryziel Fiendsmith, is just really strong. Even the Ritual deck, it's really strong. So if you can run things like Talent, that's fine. Talent's still Talent, and it's still very good, but it's less good right now, I feel, because even if you try to take a Detonator, unless you have a Bestial or a Bell to go ahead and stop the Twin, then you aren't really accomplishing much, because the card just comes back and then you wasted a card. So not my favorite right now, but it's still a one of, in my opinion, at least in the main or side. and the card itself can still be really strong, but what kind of stronger non-engine can you run for the format? And then this is the other thing that I think is really important right now, is can your deck make a good half board? What do I mean by a half board? Well, if you're playing like the Fiendsmith cards and you open like a Fualos and you get Fualos, you go just into Requiem and then pass. So you can go Requiem effect, go into Lacrima, and dump the trap. But if you hard open a Fua, you can go Requiem effect, Chainlink 2, Fua. So your opponent is now under a Fua as well. And then you also get access to the trap card, which is even better because that gives you another out to something that your opponent tries to do. So either they have to kill you, or you're going to draw into something like Nibiru and make sure that your opponent can't kill you. Then, are there any Floodgates available? This is always a fun one because, you know, these cards are really broken, but they're really less good right now because if you play against Ryziel and they have X, they just dump Mirror Logic and they're like, nice Floodgate, dog. Right, so that's something that you really have to be careful about right now. If you're gonna play a Floodgate, you have to play a chainable Floodgate. So if it's like DDG, your shared ride, which isn't really a Floodgate, but it still is because it's like Fua on crack. So that's one thing where you can even play things like Mistaken Arrest, which again, people don't usually think about these as like Floodgates, but they are. So these are going to be the more important things that you want to look for this format because the chainable Floodgates are in right now and the just long-staying Floodgates on the board are out. And again, it's all because of Extemirio. I had so many questions about my DB ladder deck. This is a Horus, Bestial, Adventure, Souls, Maliss. And I love this deck so much. It is so much fun to play. I thought I would just share the profile here real fast, just in case anyone wanted to give it a try out online. The deck itself has been so much fun, and a lot of people were asking me, like, what's the congruency? Well, for me, if you're under Lancia, right, you still have the ability to activate, like, Right, get bodies on the board, normal summon a Maliss card, and still put up a half board, but also, if there is no Lancia, you can put up your Negate, which is nice. Then you could thrust for Featherstorm if you really want to with the Griffin on the board, but you can also go for like the Horus cards and a Zombie Vamp, which will summon out a Maliss card. I did it in the mirror match, and I summoned out a Lancia, and then just passed immediately, and then Lancia'd my opponent, and they passed back, and I killed them. So, definitely a couple really cool options here that I'm a fan of. But if you want to try out something really fun, go ahead and try this out and let me know how it goes. So today we're going to build Maliss from scratch, and I really want to make sure that this is going to be as accurate into a YCS as possible for you. This is a deck that is very complicated to play right now. It's also a very complicated decision to play right now because of Lancia. So there is a couple options that you have against Lancia, and we're going to be talking about those as we go with the deck building. So just to start things off here, I only play 3-3-2 on the main deck monster count. I don't really think that you should do anything different on this. I think that it's really awkward if you do, just because you draw too mmany names at once, and the names all together don't really do anything. It's a lot better if you can draw like a name and a bunch of non-engine. So I only play 2 Chessie because it's like the worst one, and it's also going to be the one that plays the hardest into Lancia. The Dormouse will too, but at least Dormouse is a true 1-card starter versus a Chessie, so that's why I would play 3 of this over 3 of this. So 3-3-2, and then just 3 of the field spell, and then 1 of each trap card. That's just going to be your basic ratio going into the format, and then just in general too with the deck. Nothing ever really changes. I've heard some people talk about like more of the trap cards, but I don't think I'd ever play more. Just 1-1-1 is good enough. You can recycle them. And then just 1-1-1 of the links. That will never change either. I know that a lot of people are trying out 2 Binder. I'm not a fan of 2 Binder. I don't think that it's that good, especially because there's so many other options in the extra deck right now that you should also be considering. Free Shifter, because this card is just so broken. It's one of those things where if you can run it, you have to run it, especially going into this format. If you activate Shifter against Ryziel Fiendsmith, if they don't have ice, they'll just pass. They might even just go ice into X, add sword, make detonator, and then pass, which is fine. They're still under Shifter, and it's really hard for them to play. As far as Ash Imperm goes, it's Ash Imperm. These are cards you just run regardless. It doesn't really matter what deck you're playing. Ash is just so good for stopping the Molcharmies, and then also Imperm is just generically probably the best hand trap we've ever had, because it also just doesn't play into talent. but between these two, I feel like they're almost always just a mainstay. Even if Valor's not very good in the format, I still feel like Imperm's usually very good, because even going into your 6-card draw, then you can throw this on like a detonator. It's still going to be one of the best options that you have. I feel like another thing that's very true right now is that if you can run Impulse, you probably should, just like Shifter, because Impulse is just so impactful going into the format. It's literally Solemn Judgment from hand, and then also if you have an Imperm that you've already used, you blow up the card. So it's really hard for me to tell anyone not to run Impulse if you can. I know that they can be a bit pricey, but if you can get your hands on a set of Impulse or borrow them, I really would. Now that next hand trap is Droll. So this is going to be a meta call moving forward. I think that Droll is phenomenal right now, and shoutouts to Dinkon Fam. This is a ratio that he used back in Sprite, and this is something that I really do like and agree with. Having 1 Droll in the side and 2 in the main. This is something where Droll does conflict with the Shifter and the Impulse, but I think that if you draw the Droll or the Shifter, you're probably just winning the game. The board is really minimal. If you Droll a Riw player, a lot of times it'll still be like Trap, Caesar, Detonator, which as long as you can deal with that, you're in a pretty good position. And is especially if like Droll is not your only hand trap, but if you draw Droll into like the Mitsurugi deck, you're gonna have a really good time. And even a lot of the other decks that you'll find in the room, it can still be really impactful, especially against things like Tenpai. So this is something that you really want to consider. I really do like Droll in the main deck. Right now, I am going to be siding Nibiru, which is a choice. I usually will always main Nibiru, but I think that right now, especially, it doesn't really do as much as I want it to. You really need to pair it with a lot of other hand traps. And even if you're playing Impulse, I think it's fine to run Nibiru and Impulse because of the fact that if you draw one, you win the game usually. As far as if you draw both, you definitely win the game. Because if you're in a very good position, you can just like nib your opponent and then just Impulse their follow-up, and it doesn't matter that nib's cut off anymore because you never really needed it again. The games don't last very long, so the lock is less relevant, but nib is currently in my sideboard. Now for the last hand traps of the build, I do play the Bestials in the main deck, and there's going to be a couple more hand traps that we add into the side deck. But the Bestials in the main deck, I'm playing a smaller count than I thought I would have. I think that it's fine to have these, but they also are less impactful in certain scenarios. But I think that Bestials are still like one of the best things we have right now. The most premium, honestly, just because you get the body and the send off things like Druis and the addition off Magnemite. So these are cards that you probably just have to run as a 1-2 ratio. I was on Baldric for a long time, but I really am starting to like Druis Worm a lot more. I really wanted to like Baldric, but I think that you just have to play multiple Druids right now with how many bodies are on board. The fact that it just sends as well is really strong. Now the next ratio here is going to be 2-to-1 on Allure with Goldstark. I think setting out an Allure post game 1 is really smart just because the Lancia is going to hurt worse into these cards. But there are a lot of players right now that are holding Lancia for main phase, which I think is still really not a great idea, because the first card, if I draw a lure that I'm ripping, is a lure. The reason being, if they hold Lancia for main phase and you allure, they'll have to chain the Lancia to your allure so you don't get an additional body that way, and then you just draw 2 cards for free, which is pretty nice. That's one thing where you still have to reveal that you had a dark in hand, but it will resolve as much as possible. So that's one thing that I think is really nice, just because it gives you another option to get into more cards, and we'll talk about what you can draw into later to make sure that you're having a better game moving forward. Now, Thrust is a 3 of. I hated this card in the main deck until this format, and then I was like, listen, Thrust in the main deck is kind of insane. And the reason being is if you go first, you can go ahead and set things like Impulse. You can set your own trap cards too, or like Imperium. But playing Impulse with this is just broken because it's basically just thrust setting Solemn from deck, which is still really good. I also just like the 1-of tactics just because the talent is going to be still really impactful as far as like a hand rip, really. You can steal cards like Chaos Angel if they're being problematic on a board, but at the end of the day, a lot of times we're just like, oh, you did something, or you Nibiru'd me, or you Phantasmade. Sick. I'm gonna activate talent, I'm gonna look at your hand, rip the most important card out, and then full combo. And most times, if you talent look at someone's hand, you should just win the game outright. So unless you see like double Nibiru in their hand and you can out-nib, then that's a little tough. But most of the time, if you look at their hand, you should be winning that game. As for the last 2 cards in the main deck, I do main deck a copy of Ultimate Slayer. I think that's going to be the real sauce next format. The end boards with Cross and Detonator are too strong right now to out. Having the Slayer ready to go ahead and just bounce the Detonator and make the Twins the Eclipse not relevant is really impactful, and also just helps you immediately break the board. yes, your opponent has to do something to you for you to activate the thrust, but it's still very important to have a game plan for that detonator, because that's going to be the biggest problem on the board. And then just call by for consistency, of course. This card is still so good, you want to make sure that you're playing it. 3 Lancia, because Lancia, you just want to have them right now. You want to have it against Crystron, you want to have it against the mirror match. Just want to have Lancia in your sideboard. It's a very strong card. Bell, this card is really impactful right now. You can hit many different things with it. You can hit the Mitsurugi deck all over. You can hit Maliss on the field spell. You can hit things like the Twin of the Eclipse effect. But this also could be cross out if you like cross out. I don't. I do not plan on running cross out. I don't like that card at all. So if you do want to play it, you could always play it over Bell. But for me, it's just not the right option. Now, I side into triple Di-Fi because if I'm going first, I want to make sure that my opponent just cannot play the game. So if I do get Lancia'd, it won't matter too much, because if I'm passing with the Di-Fi, back row out really isn't real. Many people don't run much, and just knowing how impactful things like Di-Fi are against your opponent right now, if they're not on exactly Maliss, it's pretty insane to have something like this, because it's just another way to be able to get into a shifter. And then just my one of thrust targets, my Duster, my D-Ground, and my D-Barrier. These cards are still really impactful, and as you can see, my whole game plan is going to be using a lot of cards just to make sure there's no graveyard. That's going to be really impactful into many different decks this format. And if you are worried about Lancia, sometimes the best option for you is just to make sure that you're going to flood your opponent back as much as possible so they just cannot play. So eventually, when you get to the turn where there is no Lancia, you're just beating them immediately. Now I'm going to do the extra deck in pods. So Typhon, this was Underworld Goddess for me, but I am on Ulti Slayer and I wanted to have a good XC target. You could still play Underworld Goddess. I like that card a lot. I've definitely used it online and caught a lot of people off guard. That's a card that I always try to fit if I can. I'm not on the Fiendsmith cards, so that's one thing where you could play those and then play Underworld, but it's not for me right now. But I do like the Typhon in the extra deck. It does come up quite often. The Firewall cards, I'm still on Teraherb. I think that it's really important just having a talent out, a thrust out, evenly out, whatever you need it to be, really. It also just forces out things like Bestials to make sure that your opponent can actually try to play the game, right? So that will turn on a lot of different things for you as well, which is great. That's another thing too, where if you have something like Terahertz and you want to be able to Save Worm, it's going to put your opponent into an awkward position, because you don't have to use it right away. You can let things through and then use it a little bit later. Just know that it does negate activation, so that's something where if your opponent has a second talent, that's going to be really unfortunate. But right now, talent has been moving down to just a 1-of copy, so hopefully if your opponent does thrust and then you negate like the talent, you're in a better spot. Before, when Dark Ruler was really popular, you had to negate thrust, which was really awkward. But right now, I think that it's fine to just go ahead and wait for something like a talent. But you also can't if you're on Ryzeo, because they could just thrust into a Slayer. So you really got to make that game time decision. Then the last one here being Firewall. Firewall is still really solid, and it's very important to this deck because it gets you a lot of free advantage. Now for the next group, Access Code's a no-brainer in this deck, but I do play Update Jammer because it's very easy to pull off in this deck, and that card will just steal games immediately. Even if Access Code is negated, it still swings twice, and that's still 4,600 damage amongst the other cards that you have on the board too. I do like Update a lot. It's another option that forces your opponent to drop rock. So if you are trying to make like a more extensive play and you want to just go ahead and win the game and force out rock, you just make access under Update. They have to throw it there. Then you're actually able to go for games. So you pull like the bait and switch, right? That's one thing that I really like to do. And then Splash SP, those are also just like no-brainers for the deck. Now for the last few, I played Dark Charmer. I think that card is just way too important right now. Stealing your opponent's Chaos Angels, the Bestials, being able to go after your opponent's Malice Links as well. It's all very strong when it comes to Dark Charmer. Haggard, you have to play it. Link Spider, and then Link Decoder. The one thing I will say, though, is a lot of people play Lingaribo. I do not believe in that card. I don't think that's very good. And there's way more value in other cards right now, in my opinion, so that's why I don't run it. Because even if I didn't play something like an Update Jammer, it would just be Underworld Goddess, and that's one thing that I really like to play when I can, amongst other cards, right? So I do hope that you enjoyed today's video. This is something that I want to do more often, really just breaking down my thought process as far as deck building, and really giving you the information you need to make your considerations going into your own events. Definitely go ahead and join my Twitch, Twitter, Instagram, and join my Discord if you haven't already. Subscribe to the channel, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Thank you all so much.